I've been meaning to make a response to videos put out by a Canadian YouTuber, JJ McCullough. The only reason I mention his nationality for this video is because I'm going to address his ideological bent leaning towards English imperialism. For those of you not familiar with JJ McCullough, he is both a YouTuber and occasional contributor to Canadian news outlets such as Sun News. Most of his content consists of commentary of various observations of customs and cultures of countries across the entire world, but a large portion of his videos focus on the affairs of Canada and the United States. He's one of those YouTubers that like to pepper his videos with 8-bit video game sound effects and animated cartoons to give his videos a light-hearted, playful charm.
Once upon a time, the British Empire controlled much of eastern North America. Then in 1776, 13 of Britain's North American colonies left the empire and formed the United States of America. You have to be able to look at the national borders and say, yes, these people living in here have enough in common and are united by enough of a shared national purpose to need their own citizenship and government and flag and all the rest.
But don't let the style distract you from the substance of what this man is actually saying. His videos might be more fun and easier to understand for those of us who haven't learned how to adequately speak French than, say, his rival Thomas Gauthier. But after looking at the facts of the matter and context of Quebec's history, I sympathize more with Gauthier. For those interested, I plan on making a video addressing him later. My issues with JJ are not so much the somewhat phony abouts he uses to replace the word about, but it has to do with his thinly veiled irredentism. He might not have outright said that he thinks that the English-speaking part of Canada and the United States should merge under one government, but he says many of the same things as the people who want to see that happen. Well, as an English-speaking natural-born citizen of the United States, I oppose a merger of Canada and the US, regardless of which government ends up wearing the pants in that scenario. If millions of Canadians are suddenly citizens in my country, the Overton window would shift to the neoliberal progressive side and our Democrat Party would never lose an election again. Considering how corrupt the Democrat Party is, coupled with Canadians ostensibly being anti-gun and misandrist gynocentric feminazis, and me being a male men's rights activist, I have a vested interest in that never happening. This isn't me saying the fascist GOP is much better. In November of 2024, there is a possibility the United States is going to have its Weimar moment and turn into a totalitarian fascist Protestant theocracy. And given that I hate the politics of the rest of the English-speaking world, I am trying to do my research on what country would be best to move to and learn their language in case the Heritage Foundation goons take after Walter Ulbricht and make Republic Flucht illegal. Sure, some of you might refute that by saying that we could just let in all the right-leaning Canadians, excluding the progressive ones, seeing as the progressive Canadians want nothing to do with the US anyway. While I agree that it's always a relief when dirtbag leftists and woke anti-white, man-hating feminazis leave the country I reside in, as many others have mentioned before me, Canadian conservatives are distinct from conservatives in the US. It might be worth mentioning there is also a distinction between the likes of the People's Party of Canada, who would fit in well within Republican-controlled areas in the US, versus the neoconservative Tory Party, the Conservative Party. My experience with Canadian right-wingers is twofold. They are either annoyingly gynocentric and put women on a pedestal they don't deserve to be on, or they're just English imperialists that support stronger interdependence between English-speaking countries regardless of political leanings.
I think the psychological burden of proving distinctiveness weighs heaviest on those countries who are clearly part of some larger geographic civilization, but have nevertheless been cut into discrete pieces, usually for reasons of imperial logic that are not self-evident today. Out of all of the big and little brother countries, Canadians and Americans are probably the two most similar nationalities in the world, and the two types of people that are most easily confused for each other, and frankly the most likely to be on the receiving end of jokes or dry comments by other countries about how indistinguishable we are. Like, have you heard this one? A Canadian and an American walk into a bar, and no one could tell them apart because they were culturally identical.
Believe it or not, I actually think that on economic issues, the Canadian Tories are further to the right than the GOP. Sure, in the past, from the Reagan to the Bush eras, the GOP was the epitome of economic liberalism, deregulation, and slobbing the knobs of the wealthy and powerful. But as a consequence of big tech companies' corruption and censorship, the lying press, and sanctions from businesses, many affiliated with the GOP or our right wing realized putting all the power in the hands of big business businesses isn't a good idea. Not saying all are conservatives, of course. There are right-wing people here whose economic libertarianism is closer to the views of Gene Epstein than the corrupt dumpster fire of Bush and Obama's economic policy. And look, I'm not perfect in this regard. I used to think that Quebec should be given back to France or that the Spanish-speaking South American countries should be unified before realizing both the hypocrisy of that desire coupled with the political differences all those countries have with one another. In fact, I would like to see all the toxic anti-American woke crowd to make good on their threats to leave the United States. If there wasn't a language barrier, I would suggest trading with Marxist-Leninist states, our leftists for their capitalist dissidents. That way, everyone can be happy they live in a country with the government they want, as opposed to different governments hell-bent on conquering one another and achieving hegemony for their own benefit, and not to the citizenry anywhere. Most people in the GOP agree with this outlook, and the only people in the US that don't are imperialists. Same goes for any other nation that thinks the same way. Before I wrap this up, I want to also mention his downplaying of considering the Spanish-speaking countries as being North American just because they all speak another language at a top-down level.
Why do you always say American when referring to the culture of Canada and the United States? Why don't you say North American? It is a fair question, and they're right. I do this, and I do it on purpose because I'm trying to make a specific point. So let's talk about that. Whenever you hear someone use the adjective North American to refer to something about the culture of this continent, for example, calling rock and roll North American music, or referring to North American portion sizes, or whatever, it is usually a pretty good tell that the person talking is a Canadian. And what the Canadian is saying when he uses this term is, I want my country to be recognized as a co-equal contributor to the culture of this continent. And frankly, I just don't think this is a very accurate way to conceptualize North America. North America isn't a continent like Europe or Asia or Africa, which house many different nations and nationalities, thereby making ideas like Asian culture or European culture very broad concepts that can be quite challenging to define. You have to look at a bunch of discrete countries with very distinct characteristics of language, religion, history, geography, wealth, and tradition, and try to determine what overlap exists among them. North America, by contrast, is dominated by only two big countries, the United States and Canada, which are very, very similar. I guess I should just pause to say that I am excluding Mexico from this analysis, because in my experience, Mexico is almost always excluded from conversations about North America as a cultural space. I understand that even the Mexicans themselves use the term North Americanos to describe Americans and Canadians as a people distinct from themselves. I'm also not going to get into the whole everyone in Latin and South America are Americans too debate. The question of whether there exists a shared culture uniting the entire Western Hemisphere is a topic for another day.
Sorry, JJ, but Mexico, Belize, Costa Rica, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Panama are all part of the same continent you and I currently live on, regardless of whether or not you wish to pretend otherwise. When there are alliances or trade agreements that apply to all nations on North America, it's only fair to include them since we're all on the same continent, and it's rather suspicious if you express a desire to exclude them from North American affairs. Sure, there's a language barrier, but guess what? The European Union exists, and most of those countries all speak different languages from each other. Same goes for the African Union and the Commonwealth of Independent States. Those last two don't use English as their business language, so pray tell what your argument is besides an arbitrary encroachment of Anglicization. I am quite aware that there are many people who resent the fact that the sun has set on the British Empire, and that right now the United Kingdom is collapsing under its own weight. And look, it's not that I don't appreciate that JJ is a civil guy in his criticisms and commentary, such as his dialogue with Thomas Gauthier compared to this.
You just assaulted me,
Okay. But I felt someone had to step up to the plate and call out his agenda, and I feel that hits different when it comes from me. A United States citizen who was born in the country as opposed to a French Canadian or a Canadian nationalist, which as JJ mentioned is progressive as opposed to right-wing. For those of you interested, I will leave a link here to a video I plan on making in response to Thomas Gauthier. Now, I don't speak French at a level to adequately hold a conversation, and will use an online translator to translate what I have to say for a French-speaking audience.